it's safe to say I have several listening that are daily Bible readers. Some of you have probably been reading your Bible for years through different. Some of you have been reading them through the chronological Bible, going from Genesis to Revelation. Some of you probably have just been picking up your Bible and just starting in your regular Bible. Some of us may just read a couple of chapters a day. But I would say that probably those of us listening, many of us have a Bible regimen that we read every day somehow. I am that person that tries to read my Bible every year. But if I'm honest, I don't always finish. I always look for January 1 as my redo, a restart. And I get my Bible out and I get ready. And I've done the same thing this year. But if I'm honest, and some of us are like this that's listening, we get distracted. We may get distracted by life. It just happens. Sometimes I get distracted by a deeper study. I find something that I really enjoy, and then I get off and start studying that, and before I know it, I'm way off of my reading plan. I actually met a lady a couple of weeks ago that told me that she read her Bible through 5 times last year. That's dedication. This year, I sat down with my YouVersion on my iPad, and I decided to pick a Bible plan from there. And I would really like to talk to the guy the person that put this together. The plan that I chose says I'll get through the Old Testament once and I'll go through the New Testament twice. Way different than what I normally do. So I said I'll give it a shot. I began this reading this year, and it was Genesis, Luke, and Revelation, beginning January 1. On January the 12th, it starts with Job chapter 1. I have no idea what happened to Genesis at that point. So I'd like to find out why they switched in midstream. But I decided to continue. I decided to read the book of Job, and the more I got into it, the more I just couldn't put the book down. And I came across this reading one Saturday. It's Job chapter 28. And when I read Job chapter 28, it really didn't read right. It didn't seem to connect with the first 27 chapters. And so I knew there was something different, and I thought, well, maybe I just wasn't concentrating. So I went back up to Job 28 to read it again, and this time the heading at the top said that it was an interlude. That it was an interlude is a pause or a break. And I actually preached this sermon a couple of weeks ago for a church. And when we went through talking about Job 28, what I thought was something that I had found that maybe nobody had seen, there was actually a lot of comments of people that were long-time Bible readers, including the lady that had read her Bible through 5 times last year. She actually talked to me, and she said that she's noticed Job 28, knew it didn't fit, but didn't understand it. And so she very much appreciated this lesson and this explanation of what's going on. If you actually do some study on Job 28, there's actually a group of scholars that will actually say that Job 28 was not written by Job, that it doesn't belong in the book. That's how different it reads. Some call this a poem. And these scholars say that actually a scribe that wrote the book of Job, that actually penned the words, inserted his own poem there in Job 28. That's wrong. I believe without a shadow of a doubt that Job wrote the book, the chapter 28. And I believe that because I believe that that was Job's moment of clarity. And we're going to say that a couple of times tonight. So today we're going to spend time looking at Job 28. In order for us to look at Job 28, we've got some homework to do here. We've got some groundwork to cover. We've got to go through the first 27 chapters of Job. And when you begin reading in Job, you really need to pay attention to Job chapter 1 and verse 1. And for some of us, when you get to reading the things that Job says, sometimes it would be good to write this on a Post-it note and keep turning it over every page as a reminder of who Job was. The Bible said in the land of Uz there was a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless, upright, he feared God, and he shunned evil. And if you read through Job, you will find out that Job was a man that when he walked into town, people stopped and they listened to what Job had to say. He was very well respected in his community. He was very well known, very well loved. He'll actually talk about that in Job 29. He'll go back and reminisce about what it was like, what his life was like before all this happened to him. So as we continue through this study, we're going to begin here in chapter 1 and quickly move through the first 27 chapters. In Job chapter 1, 6 through 8, and Job chapter 2, 2 and 3, we're going to see that God has a conversation. And it's the angels have come to God, and with them, Satan has joined into this conversation. And so it says in verse 6, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with him. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Not a study for tonight, but this should scare some of us. He says, God, I was just roaming the earth, going back and forth on it. So then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless. He's upright. He's a man who fears God and shuns evil. Here it's said again. Same thing we see in Job chapter 1 and verse 1. And the Lord will say again, the Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power. This is the very first time that Satan comes before God, and he says that everything that he has is in your power, but you cannot lay a finger on Job. So the first time that they meet, Job will lose his way of life. He will lose his servants, and he will ultimately lose his children in this first conversation that Satan has with God. So it's a very, it's a horrible time for Job. And I can't imagine just living through that. But again, this is in chapter 1. In chapter 2, they're going to have another conversation. And this time the Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. He first told Satan, he says, you can do whatever you want to what Job has, but you can't touch Job. And so Satan took it all from him. And then this time, God says, you can have Job, but you can't take his life. You must spare it. And in this test, Job would lose his health. He lost his respect of his wife. Remember, she told him to curse God and die. And then he lost respect from the community. We find that sprinkled throughout Job is something that he will lose. We also will find in Job 29 that this trial that Job is going through, this difficult time that he's in, will last for months. And then something really neat happens. Okay? In Job chapter 2, Job has three friends that get together. They are Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. These three men get together and said, we've heard about Job and we've heard of what terrible things have happened to him. Let's go and let's spend some time with him. So this is a little small print, but here it says that when Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, They heard about all the troubles that had come upon Job. They set out from their homes and they met together with agreement to go and sit with him and comfort him. Then they sat on the ground for 7 days and no one said a word, because it says they saw how great his suffering was. Boy, if we just stopped right there, if Job ended right there, it would be a really good story. His friends, we know, had to have provided comfort. I've learned through my time of dealing with individuals that I've worked with that have dealt with grief and dealt with loss and dealt with trials of life, that I don't have to say anything. Most of the time, I can be more effective if I just show up, if I'm just there with them. So his 3 friends, they started off doing the right thing. They started off sitting with him in silence. But we're going to learn that they're thinking of something. One of the things that you need to understand in this book is that it's a very early writing. And at this time, their belief is that if a man was prosperous, if a man was wealthy, and a man was well respected, such as Job, then if he lost it all, then there is a sin in his life, and God is punishing him for that sin, and he must repent. And so his 3 friends could not come up with any sin that they could think of that Job may have done publicly. So they've convinced themselves that it's a secret sin. It's a sin that Job has tried to hide, but yet God has sought him out. And so they won't, their intentions are good. They won't, throughout these speeches that they're going to have, each one will talk, each one will say something, and then Job is going to respond. And that's how it just kind of repeats itself through the first part of Job, up through Job 27 that we'll get through tonight. But here's what I want you to focus on. Here's what we need to see before we move forward. I put up here, this is a roller coaster. Now, I don't do roller coaster rides. I don't do rides of any kind. I've been on maybe a kiddie roller coaster ride maybe once, but anything like this, you won't catch me on it. This picture right here, it says open 24 hours a day, and it's got all the loops and everything on it, and it has the word fear, anxiety, depression. I put that up there because it really represents Job and just some of what he's going through. And so this is Job's wild ride. This is Job's emotional roller coaster. And you need to listen to that. You need to let that soak in. This is what we're going to be looking at now is he's fixing to be on an emotional roller coaster. And we're going to make application for us in this later. But as Job is on this emotional roller coaster ride, let's see what happens. Right off the bat, after Job is set for a period of time with his friends, Job speaks in chapter 3. In verse 1, it says, after this, Job opened his mouth and he cursed the day of his birth. Wow. Job was in pain. Job was in serious pain. Physical pain, emotional pain. And the very first thing he does is he curses the day he was born. This is some more evidence of Job's pain as he looks to God. And it's interesting that when you look at the study in Job, you never once see where Job says, maybe Satan has had a hand in this. Job really thinks God has got it out for him, and he doesn't understand because he doesn't know that he's done anything wrong. And Job chapter 6 and verse 4, he will say, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. Wow. That's some pretty strong language of how Job feels like he's being treated by God. 6:5, Job will say, God's terrors are marshaled against me. In Job 7, in the latter part of verse 7, it says, my eyes will never see happiness again. Job 7, verse 16, he says, I despise my life. He says, my life has no meaning. And then in Job 17, verse 1, he will say, my spirit is broken. My days are cut short. He will say, the grave awaits me. Job thought he was a man that was dying. He thought that the life that he knew it was over, and that it wasn't long before he was going to be that he was going to die and be buried, and that life would end. And so, just at a very, very low point, you can kind of get an idea of this emotional roller coaster that Job is on. It's not a pretty picture, but we have to talk about it. In Job 19, we will see in verses 13 through 20 that Job was abandoned by his friends, he was abandoned by his family, he was abandoned by his community, and by his workers. He was abandoned by everyone. They all distanced themselves from Job. It says he will use the words in these verses. You'll see words like forgotten, estranged, alienated, offensive, and loathsome. Very, very low time. And then Job's friends are going to speak. And you would think that looking at what we just did about Job and this roller coaster ride that he's on, that things couldn't get any worse, that his friends have been sitting with him for 7 days. So they listen to what Job has to say, and they say, you know what, we've got something to say too. So it's going to be exciting to see what kind of encouragement they give Job, right? How they're going to be there for their friend. We're going to look at these three friends. We're going to look at Bildad. And we're just going to pull some of the verses out of how Bildad responds to Job. He will say in Job chapter 8, verse 1, he will say, Job, your words are empty. You're just a blustering wind. Boy, talking about hitting a man when he's down. And it gets even worse. In Job 8, verse 4, he's going to say, Job, your children died because of their sin. Basically, he's going to say, Job, your children deserve to die. That they were wicked children. And then 18 and verse 2, he's going to say that Job is insensible. Boy, I don't know if I want Bildad for my friend. Eliphaz. In Job 15 verse 2, he will say that Job was full of hot air. Job 15 verse 3, he will say that your words have no value. And then in Job chapter 22, he gets personal and he calls Job wicked and full of sin. They may be trying to get his attention. They may be trying to get him to come out with some secret sin that he may have had and been hiding. But I tell you what, these first two men that we see, their words, they have to hurt as much as the boils that cover Job from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. It's just a difficult thing that to hear this from his friends. And then Zophar. Zophar says Job speaks idle talk in 11 verse 3. And then in Job 20 verse 2, Job's words leave him disturbed. So Job is about as low as you can get. And so as we look at his three friends right here, I guess you would call them friends. I'm not sure I would do that. Listen to what they have to say about Job. But we get a good idea up to this point of just kind of roller coaster ride that Job was on. And so Job 28 is going to be his moment of clarity. Now let's pause here for just a moment and let's talk about our emotional roller coaster. Let's talk about the ride that you and I are on. We're living in a pandemic. I'm going to be honest with you. I had convinced myself that when I woke up January 1, this pandemic was going to be over. Again, it was a new year. It was a time for a fresh start. I didn't have to worry about that anymore. I wake up January 1 and guess what? The pandemic is still here. We're here waking up today and the pandemic is still here today. And it's going to be around for a while. I listened to Kent Job. He did a sermon 1st of January, or the end of December actually, getting ready for this year, and College Avenue is doing a series this year called Lean In. That's their words, is lean in. And Kent Job had a list, and so I borrowed this list from his sermon as he describes the emotional roller coaster that we are on. I liked his list better than mine. He says, right now, we are a people that's weary. We're confused. We are fearful. We've lost our routine. We've lost our outward focus. We've been through a stressful election cycle. The negative social media is it's running rampant and out of control. And so we are on an emotional roller coaster. This slide I have over here on the side talks about frustration, anxiety, anger, worry, fear, disappointment, impatience. These describe what we're going through right now. We're in a very difficult place. And so we need to take a moment. And today needs to be our moment of clarity. It needs to be our moment where we stop. We stop letting this pandemic, we stop letting the things of life have control of us. And we do like Job did in Job 28, and we just stop. And we just have this moment of clarity. And we tell ourselves that, you know what, we are going to get ourselves focused. And we are going to regain the focus that we had. Friends, I have to tell you, brothers and sisters, I got to say that we have a job to do. That this pandemic has stopped us from doing so much. We have quit doing so many things that were just a routine in the past. Things involved in the church. And just because our doors are closed and we're doing things online doesn't mean that we stop, that the church just quits working and quits functioning. So we need to get our moment of clarity, and that's what we're going to look at here in Job 28. Job 28, again, this is an interlude. This is a place where you hit the pause button or take a break. This is a theater term that comes all the way back, or goes all the way back to the 1300s is when this word comes up. And Job is going to ask a couple of questions in Job 28. He's going to say, further on down in verse 12, he's going to say, where can wisdom be found? And then in verse 20, he's going to say, where does wisdom come from? And then ask, where does wisdom dwell? I tell you, I struggled with this chapter in the beginning because when I think about God and I think about Job's emotional roller coaster ride, I think about the emotional roller coaster ride that we are on, and I think about a lot of things, a lot of attributes of God. But Job chose wisdom. So I began to ask myself, why? Why, Job, did you go to wisdom? Why didn't you be reminded of God's love or be reminded of God's mercy? But you chose wisdom. And I believe I figured out why. Job does a beautiful job in the first part of Job 28. He does a beautiful job of looking for wisdom. He actually, in the first 18 or 19 verses, he will actually give a very descriptive picture of what it's like to mine under the earth. It's a beautiful thing to read about mining that took place and how that you can find so many beautiful things underneath the earth. But guess what's not there? Job says wisdom's not there. He will even later say that the sea doesn't contain wisdom. The land doesn't contain wisdom. He will say that he will say that death and destruction has said that wisdom, they've heard about it, but it's only a rumor. So let's look and let's take a moment tonight and let's talk about wisdom. We want to talk about where wisdom can be found. This is where it starts. True wisdom, Job will say that true wisdom originates with God. And I believe that this was his moment of clarity. It was his moment to realize and recognize that true wisdom cannot be found in his friends. True wisdom can't be found anywhere on the earth. True wisdom originates with God. You and I, as we are on our emotional roller coaster, we need to take a moment, our moment of clarity. We need to recognize that God's wisdom originates with God. Job chapter 28, 25 through 28 says this. It says, when he established the force of the wind and measured out the waters, when he made a decree for the rain and a path for the thunderstorm, then he looked at wisdom and he appraised it. He confirmed it and he tested it. Job says, I know where wisdom is. It's been with God since the beginning. God has not only been with wisdom, He's appraised it. He's confirmed it. He's tested it. Again, where can it be found? Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. By wisdom, the Lord laid the earth's foundations. By understanding, He set the heavens in place. Solomon would write that in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 19. In James 3 verse 17 in the New Testament, James talks about wisdom. And he says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is, okay, wisdom that comes from heaven, that is God's wisdom, okay? Earlier than that, he'll say the wisdom that's of this earth, that is the devil's wisdom. That's Satan's wisdom. That's of the earth. So, where can wisdom be found? It originates with God. There's evidence to that. And then Job does something else. He tells us what the value of wisdom is, what the value of God's wisdom is. This is again, a very beautiful part of this chapter. If we're going to understand what Job is doing in his moment of clarity, what he has figured out, if we're also going to be able to figure this out, we need to understand the value of God's wisdom, and it is priceless. It is priceless. Job 28, going back to Job 28, beginning in verse 15, he will say, it can't be bought with jewels. It can't be bought with the finest gold, nor can it be weighed out in silver, nor can it be had for jewels of gold. The price of wisdom is beyond rubies. It cannot be bought with pure gold. There's nothing. There's not a precious jewel on this earth that is more valuable than God's wisdom. Job says God's wisdom originates with Him, and it is priceless. Proverbs 4 verse 7 says the beginning of wisdom is this. He says, get wisdom, though it cost you all you have. Get understanding. Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 13 and 15 says, blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and yields a better return than gold. She is more precious than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with her. Wow. Very similar to what we see Job write in Job chapter 28. Solomon describes it here. Also, wisdom is something that is priceless. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 19 says, wisdom makes one wise. It makes a wise person more powerful than 10 rulers in a city. Here's the cool part. So we understand now, Job has helped us understand that wisdom, that true wisdom originates with God. And it's priceless. But here's the good news, is that God offers that wisdom to His children. To those of us that are His children, to those of us that have obeyed the gospel, those of us that are Christians, God says, I'll make it available to you. God's wisdom that originates with Him, that is absolutely priceless, God says, I will give it to you. All we have to do is ask. Isn't that beautiful? That tell you how much God loves us? How much God wants to take care of us? James chapter 1 and verse 5, he will say, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously without finding fault, and it will be given to you. I believe this was Job's moment of clarity, just like it should be for you and I. If we're going to get through this pandemic, if we're going to get through our emotional roller coaster, and there will be a time when this pandemic is going to be behind us. It won't be forgotten, but it will be behind us. And there will be another emotional roller coaster that we're going to be on. And when we go through those in life, we need to remember. We need to remember God's wisdom. Remember that what we need to do is we need to ask God. And we need to ask faithfully. James will continue to say, he will say, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. That person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. That is in James 1, 6 through 8. So when you and I ask God for wisdom, we must do it faithfully. That is what, if we're going to ask God, God says, I will give it to you, but you must ask faithfully. And there's something else that we must do also. We must ask with the right motives. James 4:3 says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives. That's important. God says you could ask me for wisdom and I will give it to you, but you must ask faithfully. And when you ask, you must ask with the right motives. Let me explain here. Go back to James chapter 1. You look at the first 6 verses there. In the beginning of that, he talks about this word perseverance. Before that, he will actually say that trials comes in many shapes and sizes. I always say they come in different colors, different sizes, different lengths of time. And he talks about perseverance. And he says to bear up underneath that trial that we're going through. That's what perseverance means, to bear up under. And so when we ask God, if you ask God, how long is this going to last? God, why is this happening to me? We go to that why a lot of times. How long? We're not going to get the answers. We're not asking the right questions. We're not asking God the right way. When we ask God for wisdom, we need to ask Him, God, I need you to help me persevere. God, I need you to open my eyes to how I can persevere through this emotional roller coaster. As we have our moment of clarity, we need to ask God to give us strength, to open our eyes to see what He's doing in our lives, to get us through that emotional roller coaster. So we got to ask with the right motives. And then there's something else. Once God gives us wisdom, once He's done His part, then we need to display that wisdom in our life. James, staying with James, in James 3 verse 13, he says, are there any of you who are wise and understanding? You are to prove it by your good life, by your good deeds, performed by humility and wisdom. You see, we need to have our moment of clarity. We need to ask God for wisdom. We need to ask Him faithfully. We need to ask Him with the right motives. And then we need to display that wisdom by living a good life, by doing good deeds. Ephesians 5:15-16 says, be very careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. When God supplies that wisdom, we must display that by living a good life. We must display that by making the most of every opportunity. Job chapter 28 is a beautiful chapter. It is an interlude. It is a pause or a break. Job, after his moment of clarity, you can read Job 29 and it still reads different. Job will not talk like he did in the previous chapters. in his moment of clarity, I believe he comes to an understanding of God's wisdom, and that gets him through his emotional roller coaster. I wanted to conclude tonight by going back to Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3. This is kind of small here, but I want to read this to you. This is verses 21 through 26. It says, "My son, do not let wisdom and understanding out of your sight. Preserve sound judgment and discretion. They will be life for you, an ornament to grace your neck. Then you can go on your way safely, and your foot will not stumble." Here's the good part. He says, when you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Have no fear of sudden disaster or the ruin that overtakes the wicked. For the Lord will be at your side and will keep your foot from being snared. You see, God says, I will give you wisdom if you will ask. And with that wisdom comes protection. You won't be afraid. Your sleep will be sweet. You will have no fear of disaster. We need to have our moment of clarity at this time. And we need to ask God for wisdom.